Hello. In this presentation, we are going to talk about how to classify and describe the consonants and the vowels of English from the point of view of articulatory phonetics. This means that we're going to describe how the sounds of English are produced as concrete physical objects. We will provide, as you can read from the title slide, a phonetic description of the sounds. In order to do this, we will rely on articulatory criteria and auditory judgments, or sometimes both, to describe the consonants and vowels of English for the variety known as General British. In this class video in particular, we will focus on consonants and how they are classified in terms of place and manner of articulation. Let's consider the criteria for a minute. There is a basic phonetic distinction between how vowels and consonants are realized. Consonants are produced by restricting and narrowing the airflow through the mouth. Therefore, we'll find that they are most easily described in articulatory terms, since we can generally feel the contact and the movements involved. We'll get into these articulatory movements shortly. In the meantime, let's go back to vowels. For vowels, the air flows relatively freely, although the shape of the mouth cavity may change. So vowels, depending as they do on subtle adjustment of the body of the tongue, are more easily described in terms of auditory relationships. But let us begin with consonants. Alan Cruttenden, in his book Gimson's Pronunciation of English, suggests that a phonetic description of consonants must provide an answer to the following questions. I'd like you to take a couple of minutes to go through the questions, so feel free to pause the video. Once you're ready, click on play and we continue together. So, we need to answer questions such as: is the airstream pulmonic or non-pulmonic? Is it egressive or ingressive? Is the sound voiced or voiceless? Is it oral or nasal? Where is it articulated? And how is it articulated? What is its place and manner of articulation? We will now turn to each of these questions to describe English consonants in detail. We are going to take the first two questions together and follow Pamela Rogerson-Revel to claim that all English sounds are produced by expelling air from the lungs through the mouth and/or the nose. For that reason, we will describe English sounds as egressive pulmonic. Let's pass on to the next question, the one that refers to the vocal folds vibration, and let's have a look at these voiceless voiced pair of English consonants. We can clearly state that for the first element of the pair, the vocal folds are not vibrating. For that matter, we are in front of a voiceless segment. Whereas for the second element in the pair, we can clearly say that the vocal folds are vibrating. For that reason, we are in presence of a voiced segment. But this voiceless voiced pair is not only distinguished by the absence or presence of voice, but also by the degree of breath and muscular effort involved in the articulation. Those English consonants which are usually voiced tend to be articulated with relatively weak energy. They are called leanies, whereas those which are voiceless, they require a strong energy to be produced. So, for that matter, they are called fortis. So, is leanis a synonym of voiced? And is fortis a synonym of voiceless? Well, not exactly synonyms, but they are related, voicing and muscular energy in the production of voiced and voiceless segments. Voice segments require less muscular energy in their production, whereas voiceless segments requires a lot of energy to be produced.
J, je,
Time to pass on to the next question. As we mentioned before, all English sounds are produced by expelling air from the lungs through the mouth or the nose. But how can we tell if a sound is oral or nasal? It is the position of the soft palate what determines whether a sound is oral or nasal. Now, let me show you these short videos and let's pay particular attention to the position of the soft palate. Let's take the first video.
j, je, j, je, j, je.
In the first video, the soft palate is raised and the nasal resonator is shut off, so the airstream coming from the lungs finds its way out through the mouth. Can you see the soft palate touching the pharyngeal wall, blocking its way up to the nasal cavity? So this is an oral sound. But what happens in the second video? Is the velum raised or lowered? Watch. Can you see the air finding its way out through the nasal cavity? Well, that is possible because the soft palate is lowered. So, if the soft palate is lowered, the airstream finds its way out through the nose. Then the sound is nasal. Now it's the turn for the fifth question. If we consider where the airflow is obstructed in the production of the sound, we will be able to provide 8 possible places of articulation for English consonants. You might identify some of the names in this particular picture that accompanies the slide. Yes, dental, palatal, velar, bilabial, alveolar. Let us now go in detail and see how a consonant sound is distinguished by its point of articulation. In other words, the place in the vocal tract where the airflow is obstructed. If the two lips are the primary articulators, then the sound is bilabial, as p in pan, b in ban, m in mat, and even w in wet. You can see that the first sound is produced, yes, with very, very rounded lips. If the lower lip articulates with the upper teeth, then we're in front of a labiodental sound, as f in fan and v in van. When the tongue tip and rims articulate with the upper teeth, then we have a dental segment, as in thin and in breathe. When either the blade or tip and blade of the tongue articulates with the alveolar ridge, we have alveolar segments. As you can see, there are many alveolar sounds in the English phonological system, as t in tin, d in dip, s in sip, z in zip, l in leap, n in night. And what about r in read? Well, phoneticians here sometimes described it as an alveolar segment, as Rogerson and Revel, and others will describe it as a post-alveolar segment, as Cruttenden does, by saying that the tip of the tongue articulates with the rare part of the alveolar ridge, and for that reason being post-alveolar. But what matters to us is that this sound occurs in terms of place of articulation in the alveolar area. For the articulation of the palatoalveolar segments, either the blade or the tip and blade of the tongue articulates with the alveolar ridge, and at the same time there is a raising of the front of the tongue towards the hard palate, as it is the case of sh in shed, zh in leisure, ch in teach, and j in edge. When the front of the tongue articulates with the hard palate, we are in front of a palatal segment, as it is the case of ya in yacht and yet. You might have noticed there is no head diagram for this particular segment. Remember, this segment shares phonetic characteristic with vowels as it is produced with open approximation, but phonologically it occupies marginal positions in the syllable. When the back of the tongue articulates with a soft palate, we have velar segments, as k in cat, g in dog, and ng in sing. When there is an obstruction or narrowing causing friction but no vibration between the vocal cords, we have glottal segments, as it is the case of in home. If before we consider the place where the airflow finds the obstruction, now it's time to consider how the airflow is obstructed when we produce sounds. Therefore, we ask ourselves questions such as, are the lips held tightly together, preventing the air from escaping, or is there a narrowing allowing the air to escape? For example, unless we remove the complete closure produced by the lips when we say the first sound in the word point, we won't be able to produce the rest of the word. But now, if we say fun, we find the air escaping with friction through the narrowing left by the contact of the upper teeth and the lower lip. This is precisely what we are looking at when we classify the consonants according to manner of articulation. In other words, describing the manner of articulation of a sound involves describing the different degrees of narrowing or stricture of the airflow that is caused by the movement of the articulators. Let us now look at the levels or degrees of stricture. Which are these levels or degrees of stricture? It can be said there are three possible levels or degrees of strictures of the airflow. The air can be stopped completely, partially, or the air may escape relatively freely without producing friction. This gives three different degrees of stricture. If the obstruction made by the organs is total, then we described that degree as complete closure. If the obstruction made by the organs is partial, then the degree of stricture is described as partial closure or close approximation by different authors. And if the separation between the organs is such that the air escapes relatively freely without producing friction, then the degree of stricture is described as approximation or open approximation, and some other writers and phoneticians call it as well narrowing without friction. Regardless of the different names, yes, we described three different levels in which the air can be modified completely, partially, or the air may escape relatively freely. Now, which are the English consonants that are produced with complete closure? And which are the ones produced with close approximation? What about open approximation? Let's classify them according to their manner of articulation. There are three groups of segments that are produced with complete closure. These groups are plosives, affricates, and nasals. A plosive segment is produced with a complete closure at some point in the vocal tract. Behind that closure, the air builds up until it is released explosively when the obstruction is removed. The first segment in the following words introduce examples of plosives: pay, boot, tea, down, car, gate. Affricates are as well segments produced with complete closure at some point in the mouth. The air built up behind that closure, but the separation of the organs is slow compared with that of plosives, so that friction is a characteristic of the second part of the sound. We have examples of affricates in the word cheese and in the word joke. Finally, within this group, we have the group of nasals, in which there is a complete closure at some point in the mouth, but as the soft palate is lowered, the air finds its way out through the nose, as the words modern, name, and sing exemplify. Within the group of segments which are produced with partial closure or close approximation, we find the group of fricatives and the lateral segment in English. The lateral segment is produced with a partial but firm closure at some point in the mouth. The airstream is allowed to escape on one or both sides of the contact. So clearly we understand why this segment is called lateral. In the case of the group of fricatives, we can say that two organs approximate to such an extent that the airstream passes between them with friction. And that is the case of the biggest group of sounds in the English phonological system. The following words exemplify these fricative segments: fan, van, thin, breathe, sip, zip, ship, measure, home. Finally, we have the third group called approximants or frictionless continuants, or these segments produced with approximation. What does that mean? Well, in the production of these particular segments, a narrowing is made in the mouth, but the narrowing is not quite sufficient enough to cause friction, otherwise they would belong to a different category. That's why they are called frictionless and continuants. We can produce these segments as long as we have air in our lungs. These are the group of approximants, and they are vowel-like in the production. However, we need to bear in mind that they function phonologically as consonants. That is why they appear at the edges of syllables. You can check on these with the following examples: run, wet, yes. So all in all, this table summarizes all the information needed to classify English consonants. You can read the place of articulation on the vertical axis, manner of articulation on the horizontal one, and within each box a pair of sounds in which the voiceless consonant appears on the left and the voiced one on the right, whenever possible. And it is precisely this information what allows us to name this English group of sounds. In order to do so, we follow the formula on the slide. First, we refer to voicing. Secondly, to the place of articulation. And thirdly, to manner. So, if we want to name the first segment in the word consonant, it is not k. Technically speaking, the first segment in the word consonant is the voiceless velar plosive. Remember, voice, place and manner. Voiceless velar plosive. Now, make sure you go through the intersection between place and manner of articulation to learn how to name all the consonants that belong to the English phonological system. Would you like to read more about classification of consonants? Do you need to complete your notes? Do you need more details about place or manner of articulation? Okay, we'll leave you these two texts for references that you can find within the theoretical class folder. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention and for being there.